Hello again. So in this session, I'll be talking about the adventures that me and my co-authors had while we try to set up a second factor on websites and then try to regain access after pretending to lose access to our second factor. And I worked on this with Maximilian Häring, Theresa Mädler, Matthew Smith, and Christian Tiefenau. A few months ago, a friend of mine asked me what he could do to increase the security of his accounts. And I, as a security researcher, said, well, just enable 2FA. But then he expressed his fear of losing his phone and asked whether he would still be able to access all of his accounts afterwards. And to be honest, while I knew in theory what could happen, I had no idea how websites currently actually handle such kind of situation. And so we decided to figure that out. To understand that, we selected 78 top traffic websites and services on which we were able to create an account and also set up a second factor. And then we set ourselves two tasks. So first, 2FA setup, we used SMS if possible, followed by email, followed by Authenticator app. And if we did not have to, we didn't do anything else. So we didn't create any backup or downloaded any backup codes, for example. After that, we didn't use the account and just waited. And then afterwards, we tried to access our accounts without having access to the second factor. In this case, we also didn't have access to our backup codes if the websites previously forced us to do anything with them. But we had access to the mail that was connected to our account if we didn't use that as the second factor. And then we tried to look for help on the login screen. If those didn't help, we look in the website's FAQs. And if those also didn't help, we simply Googled. And here's an overview of the second factors that we used. So as you can see, in most websites, we could simply receive a code via SMS. And in 25 cases, we used Google Authenticator. And email and password were only used in around a tenth of the services. OK, now let's have a look at the 2FA setup procedure. And specifically, we were interested in how services communicate the issue of losing the second factor and whether they help their users in setting up a backup plan. While analyzing what websites did, we found three different cues that websites used to guide the user. The first one was a hint. So this means that the website would mention that the second factor might be inaccessible at some point in time. And we saw very different variations of this, ranging from this lets you log in if you don't have access to your second factor, to you will permanently lose access, forever, no exception. So this ranged quite a lot, but we summarized it all under the cue of hint. Second, we checked whether it is possible at all to add a second factor or some kind of backup possibility to still access the account. And this could look like this, where I'm just being asked to add my phone number after I just set up the Authenticator app, or like this, where I could just toggle on the next option that I want to use as a backup possibility or alternative possibility. And third, there were some websites that forced us to do something which we call force. So in that case, we, for example, had to download backup codes before we could proceed with adding the second factor or had to do something else. After that, it also varied where the cues were shown. So in some websites, this information was added the same pop-up that was also used to add the second factor. And in other cases, all information was simply back in the settings where 2FA activation was started in the first place. And let's have a look at the results. So the most common combination was to make the user aware that they might lose their second factor and to also offer a backup, but to not force them to do anything. And this was done by 29 of the services. Second most often was to not do anything at all. So these websites didn't say anything about losing the second factor, not having access to it, and also didn't give any clear, visible possibility to add a backup. And this is followed by the exact opposite, where websites hinted to the problem, offered a backup, and even forced the users to do something. And that was done by 15 websites. So taken together, around 65% mentioned something about losing the second factor, 80% offered backup possibilities, and 20% forced the user to do something. And so taken together, we see that there's currently nothing a user can assume by default, and even worse, nothing they can really rely on when adding a second factor to their account. Moving on to recovery, meaning our attempt to log into the account without having access to the second factor and without access to the backup codes. And first we wanted to know how services assist a user who lost their second factor. For this, we analyzed the login screens and found that websites use two different levels of support. The first one was to suggest the user to use a backup, for example, a backup code or simply an alternative way to receive the code. And this was either there or it wasn't. And the second was to give an additional link to the support. However, this link varied. So we had some websites that directed us to a direct form that handled access problems that we simply just needed to fill out. Then we had cases where we were directed to a specific FAQ that kind of handled the issue of losing the second factor and tried to help the user in their next actions. Then we had situations where we were directed to a general FAQ, mostly simply the main page of the FAQs where a user then can search for themselves. Then we had cases where we had a link, but that didn't help at all. So for example, in one case, we had the button of account recovery, but when we clicked it, we were just directed back to the login screen, and that was where we started. So we could do that over and over again, and it didn't end up anywhere else. Then we had cases where we didn't have a direct link, but like a always visible support chat that we could then use to try to find help. And then we had cases where there was nothing at all, so nothing a user can click to receive help. And here you can see the results. We believe that linking to a direct form and also suggesting to use a possible backup is probably the best combination for a user. So in these cases, they might be reminded that they have a backup code somewhere or that they have an alternative way of receiving the code. But if they also cannot access it, they have a very easy possibility to access the support or to contact the support without any detour. And on the contrary, there were 14 websites that did not give any help at all during login. So they didn't suggest using a backup, nor did they link to any support at all. So in all of those cases, a user can simply cancel their current login attempt and hope to find information somewhere else on the website. In cases where websites did only link to a general FAQ or didn't do anything at all, we checked whether websites had in fact a subpage in their FAQs that was kind of better, so it kind of handled the issue of losing the second factor. And the two purple rows show part of our results. And as you can see, a large number of those that did not link to anything specific had in fact a better subpage. And especially all 14 websites not helping at all during login could have done something better. So again, we see that there is no common practice on websites. And while it's common for websites to have some form of forgot password link during login, this is often simply missing from the login masks for 2FA. And now I'm coming to a question you're probably all waiting for. Did we regain access to our accounts? And if yes, what did we have to do, or what information did we have to provide? So first off, we gained access to a bit over half of our accounts. And it was a bit easier if we used SMS or email as the second factor. I want to point out that on those websites where we could not regain access, we sometimes had the possibility to let our accounts be deleted. And in other cases, we assume that we might have gotten access if we had used the account in a more realistic way. So for example, really purchased something. But what did we have to do? So, and I guess you can assume it by now, there's no common practice. So websites used one or several of the following approaches to check whether our request was legitimate. The first one was personal information, for example, name or addresses. The second one was that we were asked to upload our identity document. Then we had accounts where we were asked to provide basic account information, for example, a username or payment information. Then we had those with extended account information, for example, about the last purchase or the date the account was created. And then we had those where we needed to have access to our email addresses. And most commonly, 7 times, we were asked for basic account information and also needed to have access to our email, so really interact with a link, for example, or really answer an email that they sent. And in 3 cases, it was very easy to regain access, as we only had to provide the service with the email address that we used, and then they deactivated 2FA, and that was it. So they sent an email and notified us about it, but we didn't have to interact with it at all. So in those cases, I think if there are no technical checks, that might be a real problem. Okay, so in summary, we found that there is currently no common practice in 2FA, neither during setup nor recovery, and that users are often left alone. They often have to look for help themselves and need to find a support email address within the general FAQs, for example. We also identified several open questions, and I just want to point out one, which is the general question of who should be responsible for access. So is it, for example, okay to hand over the responsibility to the user? Or should there even maybe be some kind of legal requirement for websites to have at least minimum support for such issues, especially if they handle information about financial transactions? And if you have any thoughts on that, I would be very interested in hearing them. Yeah, thank you, and I'm happy to take your questions.